Welcome to DM the PM podcast, where we cut through the noise of product jargon to deliver actionable step-by-step insights from industry practitioners, helping founders and product leaders turn complex concepts into clear, practical strategies you can apply today. As you already know, hopefully you've been listening to this podcast for a while, we have 4 different sections. We get to know a bit about the guest, then we go into myths about the specific topic. Then we're going to frequently asked questions, and this episode actually has questions from LinkedIn, so I'm very excited about that. And then we'll go through the threshold concept to really go deep into what is the minimum amount of information someone needs to know about the topic. And I am Diana, your product host. I'm a product coach and consultant. I help startups and mid-sized tech companies build impactful products in weeks, not months. I help drive business growth by creating an efficient product development process, validating ideas early, and establishing effective customer feedback loops. In today's podcast, I have the pleasure of welcoming Barry Pace as my guest. He's an incredible product leader who has been a product influence in hyper-growth companies like Gusto, Penfold, and now Clio. We work together at Gusto, and to be honest, Barry, you're the person I have learned the most from about product discovery. So every time I have to go through concepts, I always remember a lot of the advice you've been giving me, and I'm very happy to say that, there's so much knowledge you could be sharing with our guests. But in today's podcast, we'll talk about how do you actually establish effective product discovery. Thank you so much for coming on.
It's my pleasure, Diana. Thank you. And thank you for those really kind words. It's great to hear.
It gives us a bit of an understanding around your product journey, how you started in product, or what's the best part of your role at the moment.
Yeah, I'll tell you a bit about my journey into product. I actually started working as a project manager in agencies after I graduated university, and I did that for a few years. I was really just enjoying being in my early 20s in London. I kind of fell into working in agencies after university. I wasn't really thinking about my career very much. I was just having a good time, having a little bit of money for the first time ever. And it was great. And it was after, 3 or 4 years that I kind of woke up and realized that I was only using about a third of my brain as a project manager in agencies. And there were some frustrations I had about the nature of my job. And I think I came across product management on Twitter, or I was reading a lot of blogs at the time and sort of reading about the technology industry in the US. And I came across product management, and I saw it as this kind of blend of the skills that I've been accumulating as a project manager. And it kind of included a bit of the strategy type work, or at least that was the lens, that's how I interpreted it as an agency project manager. The strategy work that I didn't have access to contribute to as a project manager in agency. So I was like, that looks like the right thing for me. I went freelance and I started picking project management contracts in agencies that just had a sense of innovation or platform build around them that allowed me to kind of test some of these concepts that I'd been learning about, reading these blogs. And I think it was just blogs and Twitter at the time. I don't think I'd even read any books at this point. It started going well, and I enjoyed doing this. And so I eventually got my first product management role at an educational games startup. That was about 11 years ago now. So that was how I kind of got into product in the first place. Now I work at Clio as a product director, and I've been there for 6 months. And they're a consumer finance company based here in the UK, but operating in the US.
Nice. So you found this idea of product from Twitter, and you were like, okay, I'm going to try it, and never looked back.
Yeah, pretty much. And do you know what? Since then, whenever I've sort of done my own kind of long-term development planning, I've thought about my own progression, and I've worked with other product managers on their progression, the same kind of themes come up, and the things that kind of drive me and give me intrinsic motivation in my career on a day-to-day basis are the same today as they were when I first got into product. I feel very thankful to have kind of found it, and really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously resonate with that because I love it so much that I took it a bit far to be like, YouTube channel, podcast, every version of learning about product I can think of. So
you're very prolific, Diana.
Quantity. I do believe creativity comes from quantity, so
It's a great principle.
for. The other thing I wanted to kind of ask, because you've been, especially in the last few years, you've been part of some like big growth, like companies that have been growing very quickly, especially Gusto during the time when he became a unicorn, and I know you kind of had big influences setting up the systems for how product teams operate. And then are there any patterns you saw when it came to building products that actually help companies achieve that level of growth?
Yeah, it's hard to pick kind of individual causal reasons why the companies that I've worked at that have been successful have been successful. I don't think it's my presence there, that's for sure. But the one, if I had to pick one thing that maybe it might be unusual, or maybe what some like product or tech people might not want to hear, if I think about the organizations I've been in that have been really successful, the proximity of commercial thinking and even your finance people, the proximity of those people to product teams it brings a sense of accountability and structure to the way in which teams work, which I think is massively underrated in helping those teams be successful. I certainly enjoy working with people in finance and commercial teams. I think there's I don't know whether this is shared by your listeners, Diana, or by you, but I certainly feel like there's a sense of finance and commercial teams, they're teams to be kind of something to be resisted, and that we should just be working, we've got our customer centricity over here, we have our data, we don't need to think about that. But, particularly over the last few years, we've seen the importance of viability in businesses. And I think as a product person, particularly if your background isn't as a finance person, which most product people have not come from like a finance background, it's an area where I think product people could do really, really well to skill themselves up on. And, certainly, our shared experience at Gusto, I think there was a lot of close proximity between a really great finance team and the product teams. And I think it worked really well. I think, it was frustrating at times, it was difficult. But I think that in the long run, really good for the success of the business.
Well, there's like the healthy debate, isn't it? Like the product role is in the middle of so many things. You're meant to have those healthy tensions. And I definitely agree about the commercial side of product, because if I think about my journeys, like I've always wanted to get closer and closer and closer to owning the metrics. Obviously, at Gusto, my team was looking after conversion rate, which was quite good, but then there's obviously retention. There's so many angles to it, and I think is more, how does solving customer problems or solving the right customer problems also make money for the business? It's a nice loop that's very hard to get right, but I think you can't miss the part of it has to make money for the business.
Yeah, and I think that's been, as I said, I think that's been like much more important in the last like 2 or 3 years, as we've seen, the tech sector struggle everywhere.
In a previous podcast, you mentioned the importance of having shared values in a company for PMs to actually be successful. And, I definitely resonate with that around what is kind of the ecosystem or the shared product mindset. And can you tell me a bit more about like what elements are like need to be present for product to actually be successful?
Yeah, I think, and it particularly aligns with the way I think about product discovery. And when I look back at the companies I've worked at, I think the two things that are most important is a sense of a kind of an openness and a desire to, not a desire, more of a culture of experimentation and being able to try things, even if they're not the way in which we've done them before. Hey, we can give them a go. People are not too dogmatic about the way in which things are done, or that think that there's a right way to do things. The culture of experimentation doesn't just go for the things that you're building in your products, but also for ways in which you might try ways of working, ways of collaborating, ways of thinking, even ways of reporting, and ways of doing your day-to-day admin and reducing that or expanding it or whatever. So if you have that underlying culture of it's okay to try things, and that resonates through the organization, I think, and can really help deliver that kind of innovation. And the second thing is psychological safety, which I think is kind of related. And by psychological safety, I'm talking really about groups of people working together, okay to be vulnerable with each other, okay to kind of be themselves, to share their ideas, to challenge other people's ideas. I think all of us have worked in organizations where, you've been in a meeting or a workshop or something, and there's been this kind of pregnant silence after someone said something, and there's something going unsaid. And, that is a sign of there's some absence of psychological safety in that group. And as much as possible in an organization, you want to ensure that psychological safety is equally distributed to the people in the organization. Now, there are lots of people who talk about being very direct and, making sure you always say what you think. And I think that is something that works for a small group of people, and particularly people who have power in an organization. But psychological safety only really works if, your most junior, marginalized identity feels like they can be themselves and say what they think. And that is, I think if you have that in your organization, that creates the, great conditions for innovation and building great products.
Yeah, some really great points. And this episode is more around diving deeper into product discovery. And I wanted to ask, why do you think product discovery is such an important part of the PM role?
Well, I think if you want to take a really simple view of product management, or let's say like the product manager role, when it comes to the product lifecycle or like building products, you could largely say that there's like product discovery, just making decisions about what you're going to build, and product delivery, going and then building that thing. And I've always thought that once the decisions have been made, or once you're like clear on what you're going to build and take to market in modern product development, you've already built pretty good confidence that you're doing the right thing. You're investing in building something. Now, obviously, this depends. And if you're building something very, very small, then, maybe you don't have no confidence. You don't, but it's so cheap to build, we're just going to build it and find out after it's in production or in market. But product discovery, I think, is like the heart of product management, or heart of the product manager role. It's where your skills have got to be brought to bear and have impact. The ultimate measure of success of product discovery is, do you go and like achieve the things you set out to? Product delivery can happen without you. This might be a slightly contentious thing to say, but in the best kind of teams that I've worked in, product managers have less and less say in product delivery over time. It has some influence on the way in which we're thinking about building things and the order in which we do it, how releases are going to work. But I think in really good mature teams, engineers are all over this and really owning a lot of the day-to-day project management and getting things out the door, freeing up time for product management, product design, and other engineers to think about product discovery more continuously. And I think that's a really crucial part of product discovery. So in short, I think product discovery is really the product management role, and that product delivery is a thing that you can kind of try and minimize the amount of time you're spending. I'm sure that there'll be people who disagree with me and who spend a lot of time in product delivery and working with engineers to make sure that's work, and that's important work. And in many organizations and in certain contexts, that's the role, and it's worthwhile and it's difficult to do. So I think when you hear me talking about product discovery, I'm thinking more about a world where a product manager can be a little bit further away from product delivery than maybe the average would be my guess.
Yeah, and to be fair, I can see now the development more of like engineers becoming more like with more of a product mindset. So in that world, they definitely will be owning a lot more of the, okay, I want to be closer towards the solution. But the other thing, I guess, before we go into the myths section is, I agree that, the core of the product manager role is to do the discovery part. But what about people that, again, coming back to the culture and the setup of the company, they don't have that space. That space doesn't really exist. What advice would you like give them to kind of start carving that space out?
Yeah, it's really difficult. I think if you're in an organization where product discovery is not valued, or it's not seen to be a thing that, you do as a product manager, or the decisions are made elsewhere, then I think you've really got two options. And it depends on, there's so much context it depends on. So I don't think this is like really specific advice for anyone, but I think there's probably two paths you go down. One is that you sort of accept that this is not a place where that can happen, and you're happy with your role and you continue. And, maybe there's something in your personal life which is more important, and, you need the paycheck and you need to do your job, do what's expected of you, and be okay with it. I think on these sorts of podcasts, Dan, I normally hear people say, you've got to go and like grind it out. You've got to make change. That's not always true. Sometimes you've got to do what's right for you in your life. So it's important to say that before I go on to say my next bit, which is maybe the more inherited wisdom here, which is, if you want to make a difference, first it can be really hard. But the core of trying to make inroads into this is getting great insights that the people who are making the decisions, or wherever the decisions are being made in your organization, think about what they're missing. Why do you have a different perspective? And find evidence and bring that to the table. And sometimes you bring that evidence to the table and it will be dismissed. At that point, you want to take the evidence and, regarding the context that you're in, get scrappy and creative in doing something with that evidence and proving value. Now, you might have to get a bit cheeky and do something kind of, on the side, or as like a passion project in some sort of spare time that you've got to kind of prove that you've done, that this is working. And then you kind of keep doubling down on it. And the more you do it, you bring more evidence. And then at some point, there's a tipping point where you can kind of convince people that, hey, let us keep working like this. And normally you've got to find advocates in the organization. You've got to do that real upwards management grind to find people who can advocate for you and get on the same page as them and invest in those relationships. But, you often hit people problems here as well, which I think aren't probably talked about enough in products, that regardless of this stuff, you've got to think about how you navigate the people and the personalities and the politics of your organization. And that's really hard. And that's rarely in the books, to be honest. And that's how you actually make some of the differences. You can have the greatest toolkit in the world, but if you can't navigate those things, it's very difficult to have an impact. And yeah, it's something it's, I think, taken me a really long time. I've still got a lot to learn in this area, but some people I find absolutely naturals at navigating those sorts of things. And I certainly am not. And I've worked hard to try and get into a decent place in my own skills. So yeah, hopefully that's not too rambly an answer.
No, I think that's like a very good point. I think when I talk to other PMs who like want to drive change, the key question is, what is it that you want out of the role? Because sometimes it could be okay for, there's no perfect answer. Because you're right, doing the product role properly in any type of organization, I think you always have this, you need to have this drive to navigate and to have a strategy. You have the product strategy, we got to have a strategy for how do I execute my product strategy and get buy-in from everyone else around me, and then be like 5 steps ahead. And communication, and personally, when I hear communication, is again another big topic that is like, please break it down into what it should be. But it's definitely a big part of it that there isn't much guidance on how do you, like, what are the levels of really good communication. But yeah, it's probably, maybe I should pick it up in a different podcast.
Sounds like a good topic.
So now is like, we can go into misconceptions about product discovery, because I think this could also be powerful for anyone in a company that maybe they need to, start battling some of those things of like, okay, what do people tend to get wrong about product discovery?
Yeah, there are so many. And every time I start working somewhere new or start working with new people, you start to kind of feel where your differences are with them on how you think about the kind of the activities that you're doing as part of product discovery. And I would say my favorite one is probably maybe not the most common, but my favorite one is this idea that product discovery is like a process. It's like this thing where you do a series of steps and you put some stuff in at the beginning, you do a series of steps, and then you get something out at the other end. I think product discovery is largely an exercise in innovation. You're making decisions about what to build. You've got to come up with some things with some others. And I think that when you kind of processify, or God, is that a word? When you processify product discovery, you're creating, a set of conditions that are very narrow and don't give you that kind of organic, unstructured space for innovation that I think product discovery needs. So when you're working in an organization and you have a sense of, we've got to have this by this time, and you have this kind of deadline for planning for your next planning cycle or whatever, you say, okay, we've got to know what we're going to build by the end of the year. And then it's intuitive for a lot of people, particularly people who are very organized, or who like structure, to try and work back with a series of steps that they will take that will get them to there. And I think you can do that to some extent, but if that's your poor framing of product discovery, then you're missing a trick, and you're probably missing the most impactful things that you want to build. So I like to use a metaphor of product discovery of tending a garden. Whereas if you think about this kind of process way of thinking about product discovery as a series of steps where you go from nothing to decisions about what you're going to build, tending a garden feels more real to me, because it's a series of activities that you do. You kind of want to be doing them continuously. I'm a big fan of Teresa Torres's continuous discovery habits and a lot of her thinking on product discovery. And if you read about continuous discovery, it's this idea that you should always be doing, you're always wanting to learn. I got a garden a couple of years ago, and it kind of twigged to me that, working in my garden is a bit like product discovery. I'm doing more of it sometimes than others. I'm doing more product discovery in summer than I am in winter. In this case, where I'm doing more gardening in summer than I am in winter. There's still things I've got to do in winter. So winter in this case, if I'm to stretch this metaphor a bit further, is when you're right in the throes of delivery. You've decided you're building a really big thing. You never want your discovery, you never want your learning to be off. So, there'll be little things I'll do in the garden over winter, but I'm not out there every day. So I like this idea of these, and there's different types of activities you've got to do. That some are very artistic, some of them are very creative when you're deciding on, what flowers you're going to have in different parts of the flower bed. And sometimes they're very kind of manual, and there's a lot of heavy lifting, and you've just kind of got to go and do this thing, and it feels quite thankless at the time. So for that, for example, I might be digging a flower bed or something. For product discovery, that would be doing some data analysis, or doing consistent kind of generative, quite open-ended customer interviews where you're not sure what you're going to get, but you're just gathering a lot of information. So that's my stretched metaphor for busting the myth of discovery being like this kind of very process factory type machine, and much more of an organic, unstructured set of activities that you do to build something better.
I really like that. And it's, for me, I'm a visual person, so that's like really useful, because the other really important part is in your garden, you have different types of plants, flowers, and they need different level of attention based on their characteristics, which is another part of discovery, where it's like not everything is the same with the same kind of process. But I do agree that going for this fluid version, it's just very hard, I think, for people to get their head around. I think it's just generally because, it's like product discovery is to deal with uncertainty. And then the best product discovery is this kind of organic version of it, which then really throws people, because like, okay, so the best way to deal with uncertainty is to kind of leave it to more uncertainty.
Yeah, and I think if I listen back to my ramble about gardens, then I think people might be listening to this thinking, that sounds lovely, but like, how am I going to make that work in my business? And I think taking some of these concepts and thinking about product discovery and the way in which you make it work, and think about that in an ideal situation, but then actually applying it and going from wherever you are right now to this kind of idealized version of everyone spending loads of time on discovery and investing in learning is really hard to just do in the first place, but second, make a case for and make space for in most organizations.
Yeah. But I think, I still believe it's important for people not to assume that applying this process is going to lead to their results. I think it's more valuable to think, what is the purpose of each one of those things? Where am I? And what would be the next kind of what would be the trial? Like, what would be the thing I want to try next and then learn from it? What other misconceptions you want to cover?
Well, what do you think, Dan? I'm going to turn it around on you. I'm sure you've got some up your sleeve. I'll be keen to hear, and I'll keen to hear what you think the other big ones are that you've seen in your career.
I think one of the big ones is maybe it's linked to the process. Maybe this is it, because you covered a huge one that actually has different symptoms. So that's the root cause. So for example, people will be like, discovery will take too long. We don't want to do it because it's like, again, I think it's seen as this fluffy thing that people don't know what the outcome of it is. So they're just like, oh, it's going to take so long. Because a lot of teams, they take chunks of time, kind of waterfall it. Like, okay, we need to answer these questions. And then once we have these questions, after 3 months, we'll give this to you. That's a very common mistake and a misconception.
Yeah, I totally hear that. And I've definitely seen this idea that we haven't got time to make decisions about, and if you think about what people are saying is we haven't got time to think about what we're going to do. We're just going to do something. And, sometimes that type of thinking, that kind of bias for action is absolutely fine. And you can just go ahead and do something, but it's got to be in very specific circumstances. It can't be because you haven't got time. I think it's such a narrow and kind of one-dimensional way of thinking about it. I think, and you'll know this, that there are times where you have to go and build something if it's cheap. But, if you're saying, well, we haven't got time and we're going to go and spend 2 months building this thing, that's a terrible decision. You'd be much better off using a bunch of those 2 months to validate that investing 2 months is worth it. Unless your company's going to blow up in 2 months, then yeah, it's got to be a much more kind of nuanced way of thinking about it, and than this kind of binary idea of whether you should or shouldn't do product discovery, because it's going to take some time and effort.
And I think maybe because it's seen as a block of processes, but if you're breaking it off into being like, we're going to pick the right tool at the right time to answer our questions. And to be fair, I think, when people say we don't have time or it would delay us, I actually think that product discovery process probably takes the same amount of time as going through all the different sign-offs in theory, because you still need to get someone to make the decision to be like, okay, but the meetings, the amount of meetings and then the delays, and then you're it still takes you 3 weeks to kind of decide on this. You could have just validated quite a lot in those 3 weeks. So actually it doesn't add any time to anyone.
I think that's a really good point. And I think if you're a product manager, and I've had this realization as a product manager sometimes, where you've got to make some decisions and you realize your limiting factor is getting the people in a room or getting people to review something or writing it down. And you're looking at your calendar and thinking, there's a week and a half between now and then. And that should be that's when your kind of product management brain should kick in and go, how do we make that decision in 1 day or 2 days? And what have I got to do to try and make that happen? And that is a really good skill as a PM to pick, to realize when something's taking too long, not accept it, and find ways of making it happen faster without making yourself really unpopular with everyone around you all the time. You can do that occasionally, but just not all the time.
Yeah, and I think this is that, bias for action has different shapes. And maybe if you're stuck in a company that has all these processes, choosing one use case to do something different and then be like, hey, actually, we haven't lost any time, or whatever people's concerns are about you going and talking to customers. And I think another one, obviously, for not doing product discovery is that people just believe they know what the customers are going to say. That's just an overarching one where they're like, what is it we're going to learn extra when we already know, or we have analytics. That's another one of, and I guess this is maybe one thing we can cover as part of this is what elements does product discovery have? Because I always see product discovery as both doing experiments and as both looking at the data. It's a more holistic approach of answering the questions. But I think people only look at it as a user research part of it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I've certainly heard people use discovery in replacement of when they mean research, or when they mean analysis. They're going to look at some data and come back with some insights or some perspective based on that data, or they can go away to do some research and then come back, and that those things individually are discovery. I think that's fine. We don't get hung up on the semantics, but I think you're right that it's important that when you're thinking about how you bring that evidence to bear in your decision making, that it's thought about much more broadly, and that you're taking other things into consideration. And there are different, inside product discovery, there are different contexts you can be in, and that these things are individual activities inside the broader set of activities that comprise product discovery.
Yeah. And I think, because to finish that part around the misconceptions, I think product discovery doesn't mean we don't build anything. You can build stuff and you can move forward. Is actually around getting that level of evidence through a lot of different techniques. And I think that's probably, could be really helpful for someone starting out. But look, we're going to experiment, or we're going to still drive value for the business, or still do stuff, because people want people to do stuff, don't they? They're like, build something.
Yeah. And I think we'll get into this in a bit when we talk about some of the different elements in more detail, but
Nice.
Often building something can be a way to validate a risky assumption. It really depends on whether or not you build something. Exactly what it is you build depends on the specifics of the thing you're coming up with. So it might be that just by adding notions of things like fake door tests, you might build something that you ship into production to a percentage of your users, which gives them the sense that there is something, an extra value proposition or a feature or something. And that can give you some, both the interaction with that, the data you get from it, and then maybe some sort of qualitative follow-up in a survey can give you a sense of, either problem validation or solution validation, that, we're here, this thing that we thought was a problem, people are coming to the solution for it, or this solution looks like it's resonating with these people. You're building confidence that going ahead and building the real thing, not just a fake door version of the thing, is going to deliver what you expect. And I think things like that are really important steps on the way of building confidence before you get into product delivery. But yes, absolutely, you can ship things to production that do that. But also, sometimes you can do those things without building things. It does depend on the context.
Now we can go into the threshold concept, and I think going to take us through what is the minimum information that someone needs to know to understand the core of product discovery. I was just wanting to say, you're about to share your screen. You're going to talk us through it. But for anyone listening, just listening to this, go to YouTube. There's that visual version of this. But just to make the listeners aware.
Okay, so this is my take on the on kind of the bare bones of product discovery, and kind of what it is, where it fits, and the sorts of things that it contains, and maybe some tips along the way. And there will definitely be some gardening references in here, so I'm sorry in advance for everyone who's sick of gardening. So the first thing to say is, this idea of deciding what to build in product discovery. I think it doesn't exist in isolation. I've hinted at product delivery earlier when we were talking, and you can see that there's this kind of relationship where you make decisions on what you're going to build in product discovery, and that informs your product delivery. In an organization where you've got maybe multiple product teams, you've got teams working on different sorts of things. You've got some teams working on, operational systems, backend systems. You've got platform teams. You've got teams working on acquisition. You've got teams working on your core value proposition. There's all sorts of different ways in which product might be manifesting in your organization. And you're going to need these kind of things that kind of bring them together. And I think that having a product strategy or a series of product strategies, and then, before that, a core product vision, and or a kind of commercial strategy of how you're going to make money. I think this is a good way of thinking about it. And I guess the relationship here between these things is quite important. Again, it's not this perfectly linear process that you go through. You don't start with a vision, then come up with a strategy, then do discovery, then do delivery. At any point where you interact with this, something already exists. And the most important thing is that these things all inform each other. So as you learn things in product discovery, that's informing your product delivery, but also the product discovery is kind of informing your product strategy. You're learning things, and you might think, oh, that has an implication for our product strategy. Maybe we should be prioritizing this over this at a really high level. So that's how I think about where product discovery kind of fits into a modern product organization. and again, this is heavily influenced by Teresa Torres's work on opportunity solution trees and continuous discovery. There's a series of these are the kind of the series of activities that you do, and that's doing discovery, what I've called here continuous discovery. So the definition of those outcomes, the different types of research, the qualitative research, talking to customers, quantitative research, doing analysis with data, and then kind of working with the opportunities. Once you derive those opportunities from that research, and then you identify them, you frame them, and you prioritize them. And again, I think the opportunity solution tree is a great method for this. And then there's an activity of identifying solutions, and I think that's where a lot of the creativity. I think there's some creativity in the way in which you frame opportunities. But the majority of the creativity is coming to bear at this point of identifying solutions, and it is the most important part of product discovery, in my opinion, and hardest one to get right. I think sometimes you can depend on really smart, super creative people in your organizations. I like the idea of trying to kind of systematize that creativity without dragging the soul out of it, to be honest. Finding ways of having repeatable creativity. And then experimentation, a crucial part of this is mapping assumptions, figuring out, what assumptions are we making by taking this solution forward, or this series of this family of solutions forward, and which of these assumptions is most likely to trip us up, and then designing a test around those assumptions that you're able to learn whether you're going in the right direction, whether your assumption is right or whether it's wrong, as quickly as you can. And that's the point where people have got to sometimes make hard decisions, to abandon ideas. And, that's the one thing that people don't do enough in product discovery, which is to abandon things. They see things through far too much.
Yeah, I mean, I've been following this, but definitely the fourth one is the one. It's very easy to skip, because you'd be like, a solution, it could be your idea, and then you go off and you could be like, okay, I want to build this idea. And then you learn there's a lot of underlying things that if you tested the individual parts of it earlier, your idea would have been in a way better place. So like it would be a better match between what is that version that solves the problem, which I think is like really important. One question I had on this is like, I've been talking to a few people. I think there's definitely an art of choosing the outcome. I think sometimes you could put like drive revenue at the top of your tree, and then the rest of it is very hard to map. I think with conversion, it worked really well. With retention, I also struggled. So I think what type of outcome is actually quite an effective way of building the whole tree.
Yeah, again, it depends on context a lot of the time, like the size of your business, the remit of your team, how much you know, how well you understand your leading indicators and input metrics of the commercial things that matter. So for retention, for example, if you have like analysts, really dedicated analysts in your team, you can task them with doing some analysis on, what are the things that drive retention? What do we see as the levers for retention in our business? If you're targeting retention itself, your experimentation downstream is often going to take a long time, and extending your time to learning and building risk into your work stream. So the better you can identify measures of success that you can kind of narrow down to give you faster learning loops, the better. I think there are some cases where you don't need to sweat, particularly in this kind of opportunity solution tree, which I think I'll come on to in a second. Sometimes you can have different success measures for your assumption tests and your early solutions that you take to production. They can be different from your specific outcome, particularly if that's a high level business goal. And you don't necessarily have to solve that sequentially, as I've talked about. You can start with something and you can adjust it over time. I think that's fine.
Okay, nice. So I guess the key thing here is to start doing the mapping against the data that you currently have as your starting point. And obviously you will learn through doing it what things to adjust and how to get in a better place where you have a better mapping.
Okay, so I think this is the next thing that's really important, and we haven't spoken so much about like continuous discovery. I think I've hinted at it, but this idea of discovery being something that's always on. You're never not doing it. It's not a phase that you start and finish. It's always going. And I think that can be quite difficult for some people to realize, and they think, I should be spending 50% of my time on discovery, and if I'm not, I'm doing a bad job. I'm being a bad product manager. But the reality is that there's this kind of like flux between things. This is where my kind of attempt at a summer-winter analogy for product discovery comes in, where you have this kind of sometimes where you're like, we've really got to learn about what's going on, what we're going to do next. And we've got to build some confidence that we're going to, put our engineers to work on like the most important thing. And then sometimes you're right in the middle of making that happen, and you don't want the same level of intensity of discovery because there's only a certain number of hours in the day. So you dial down your discovery activities. And I think most product managers who work this way will recognize when you're in a discovery peak or a delivery peak. And, rarely can you have both going at the same time. It's not really possible for everyone's sanity.
I think this is an important point because that takes away a lot of that entry level, how hard it is in your business to introduce discovery. And I think if you're looking at it as a more organic thing aligned with what are the core things you want to do, make sure you're creating habits around it rather than that process. So I think what is that the mental model people have around discovery then will enable you to introduce elements into your business a lot quicker.
Yeah, and I think this is the great insight that Teresa Torres had in her book, Continuous Discovery Habits, this idea that you've got to form these habits and keep doing them. And once you form them as habits, they will pay off. And, I think it's a great insight and something that's been like really influential in my product management career for sure. So yeah, shout out to Teresa Torres. And this is kind of like, if you don't do that, this is what I think can happen. And when you're doing discovery, you're learning. When you're doing delivery, you're delivering value. And if you're doing one or the other, you're not getting both. And with continuous discovery and continuous delivery, you're kind of constantly delivering value and you're constantly learning. That is like a real sweet spot for a product team to be in. And if you kind of go over time where you're just doing discovery and, your engineers kind of sat around not doing anything, or, they're contributing discovery, that's great. But, you're building up more risk into your team's work stream by not delivering value, or you're not delivering value in a way that's going to give you market feedback because you're not building something into production. And then if you're just doing delivery and you're doing no discovery, you've put your learning on pause. And, you really want to try and not do that. You want to look for opportunities to still keep that learning going. And I think just a low level continuation of talking to customers or whatever it is, just to keep that habit going is super important.
I think this is an area where companies that are tight on their budget, because at the moment everyone's like tightening and they're like, okay, we want to deliver or we want to reduce, only focus on value add activities. You could be doing this for like a year to focusing on optimizing. But if you're not having some habits, you're learning, in 2 years' time, you won't know, like you'll lose towards competition or your customer needs will change and you won't actually. So the risk is maybe you don't see it immediately, but from your strategy, exactly what you showed on the first slide, it has to be a continuous loop of what are we learning that's going to help us know where the company and the product is going in the next 2 years, not just immediate value. So it's pretty important.
I think that's a really great point you made there, because in this block that I've got where you do discovery and you're not delivering value, and in this next block of you're doing delivery, you're not learning, well, what's the risk of not learning? And I think you've articulated really well there what those risks might be for a business. Okay. Shamelessly ripping Teresa Torres' stuff here. I put these slides together just to kind of like to walk through continuous discovery more generally. So a little bit of a last minute addition here, but this is kind of the visual that accompanies the activities that we walk through. And, I think these are the sorts of, there's actually a couple of, there's maybe a lot of spin on it that I added here, which maybe is worth focusing on. And I'm pretty sure I came up with this. Maybe I stole it from someone, so sorry in advance if I did that. But Teresa Torres talks about having, opportunity space, and then you can have like kind of parent opportunities and sub opportunities. And one thing I found, I was actually working at Gusto when we were thinking about different solutions that mapped these opportunities. We realized that there was a way of framing a solution as a hypothesis that could kind of contain different manifestations of that solution. So we would say, maybe I think at Gusto we were talking about like if we have a menu that works like this, then we think this will happen. And then inside that we have all these different solutions, and then each of those solutions would have their own lower level assumptions. And so we would like do a lot of these lower level assumptions and test different solution variants against each other until we had a winner. And then the core solution hypothesis is the thing that we kind of take to production. So we take that to I'm going to butcher this, and sorry to any of my Gusto colleagues listening, that I think, we had a bunch of different ideas for like different menu designs. we tested them against each other. We tested a bunch of the hypotheses. We kind of narrowed down. We took a couple forward, did a few iterations on them, ended up taking it down to one that we thought was the winner. And then we took that to a control test to our audience at large. And, people who were ordering meals at Gusto were using this new test, and we had this just a simple A/B test. And the hypothesis of that test was the solution hypothesis, not any of the lower level ones that we had of the different solution variants. So that was that's kind of, I think, a slight change that I maybe haven't seen on other in any of the literature around this. But yeah, maybe I stole it as well. I don't know.
That's really, because I think this is a space again where it's very hard to map or to kind of break stuff down, because you could be like, oh, this is one idea. So like, it's very easy to create a solution hypothesis in it. And then there's so many embedded assumptions that unless you have the practice of identifying the assumptions, you would think that the solution you come up there, it's small enough to be okay. And you could go and be like, okay, let's build this. And then you don't get the learnings because actually that solution has a lot of underlying things. So I think even from a exercise point of view, when you're doing this, I think it's worth pushing you and your team to be like, okay, what is inside this solution? Is there multiple solutions, multiple versions, or what? So I think you're right, variant is a good one, because let's say if you're building like your menu, you might have different ways in which you want to present some sort of information, or let's say the level of complexity of a recipe. You could be like, oh yeah, if we improve the level of complexity or make it simpler, people will be like, okay, it's going to be great. But what does that mean? And then you're like, okay, well, exactly. I have this variant of showing numbers, this variant of labeling, beginner, advanced, whatever. And those are the ones that you'll have underneath. And then you need to test them. Because I think a lot of teams make the mistake of having that high level solution, trying one version, not working, and then moving on.
Absolutely. I think you're bang on. And yeah, I would say in general, teams don't break things down enough and interrogate the level of detail at the kind of solution experiment level in the way that you're describing. And yeah, there's maybe a bit of a paradox there, because I think we spoke earlier about teams not willing to give up on things and kind of seeing things through. But at the same time, you want to make sure, I think you can only ditch things if you've done that kind of exhaustive thinking in this space. And I think maybe some folks might do like as you say, some like very broad solution, test one small iteration of it or one assumption and go, oh, see, it didn't work. We're going to move on to the next thing, and we're doing great product discovery because we're moving on quickly. But yeah, you're falling foul of not having broken it down enough or thought about different ways of doing it. And in fact, I think the one we used the thing we tested at Gusto, I think, was having bigger images of the meals. I think that was the core hypothesis of like, we would show off these great meals that we're providing to people, and the amazing product designers at Gusto, when we came up with like a bunch of different ways in which we might do that, and we realized that each of these had different implications and generated different assumptions. Well, if we do this, it has this knock-on effect, and therefore it creates this assumption. This one does this, has this knock-on effect, and does something else. And there's all these little loops of learning about these, mitigating these different risks. And I think, what we could have done is just come up with one idea for like what a big picture menu looks like and shipped it, or like tested it and go, oh, it didn't work very well, let's try something else. So yeah, I think having structured thinking here is super important. And also I think really important for outbound communication to your stakeholders, because otherwise they might say, oh, we've come up with a solution, let's go and build it. And you can sort of explain to them some of the nuance through this kind of shared, I think what I called in a previous slide, like a shared brain, a really useful artifact to run your sort of your senior folks, your stakeholders through, to get them on board with the decisions you're making and the type of structured thinking that you're doing.
Yeah, I think one thing here is like the experiments or the assumptions are not just product related. They could be, as you were saying in the image example, related to tech as well. So it could be implications across the whole ecosystem. It's not just like the product questions. So that's where you want everyone to really be involved.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's different like risk types, which I think maybe Marty Kagan came up with, like the feasibility, desirability, viability. What am I missing?
I think it was like Teresa Torres has her like 4 or 5 now. I think she adds ethics to it as well.
Yeah.
And then she also add, I think, not necessarily usability, but something like that. So you have like
Usability.
value, viability, feasibility, and then usability and ethics or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, certainly when mapping assumptions, it's important to categorize them in that way. And sometimes particularly, things like feasibility and viability, you're not necessarily going off and testing things with customers. With viability, you might be doing some modeling with your commercial team. And with feasibility, you might be building like a kind of proof of concepts just to prove that we can do something with engineers, or getting them to kind of look into something and build an opinion of whether how possible something is, or how long something might take in orders of magnitude. Those types of experiments and the types of learning and kind of validating assumptions can be a very diverse set of activities in its own right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Cool. Nice. Well, I think that's the threshold concept for you. I have some lessons learned. Here's my garden thing again. I'm going to shut up about that now. And I think this is maybe, I think we touched on this as well. This idea of being honest about the cultural context of your business. And a lot of the criticisms of this stuff is that it's not going to work in my organization. This is really idealist stuff that only works on paper. And it's your job to figure out how to bring some of these kind of good practices to bear in your organization. And sometimes you just can't do it. And sometimes you just sometimes you've got to accept that. Sometimes you can kind of agitate against it. And it really depends on your own situation, depends on the business, depends on the people. It can be really difficult to manage.
Well, there's always that level of, kind of the product manager roles, like people understanding the business, understanding how decisions are being made, and understanding what control or influence you have over that. But I think, coming back to the garden, I think it's not just the garden, but you have those toolkits. This is how they work. Try and not start from zero. So I think a lot of people imagine, we're going to start doing product discovery. That's we need to change everything, or we need to prepare all this stuff to introduce it, when actually the best way is kind of take things as you go. So okay, well, I want to make some change here. Choose a use case you want to do better on. It's okay, well, we want to understand the customers better. Great. Look at some insights. Look at some data. Choose one part of it that you want to try, where you think is the biggest value, and then kind of bring those things in. Because I think if you do it that way, you'll get to this organic habits a lot quicker than if you just here's a block of steps we need to do now before every single idea. Now we have this checklist. So I think, that scrappiness and creativity, I think people undermine how much of that is required in product discovery.
Absolutely. And my final slide is basically, I think, perfectly reiterating what you've been saying, this idea that don't be too dogmatic about any of the frameworks or stuff that you've read. Maybe conversely, it is difficult to take this theory and put it perfectly into practice. And I think that advice you've just given around doing things incrementally, looking for opportunities, doing it as you go is a really good way to get started. And don't beat yourself too much. Don't beat yourself up about it if you're not able to do everything perfectly as per the books. And always bring it back to your kind of first principles and find ways of making it incrementally better over time.
And now we can go into actual questions that came from LinkedIn, which I'm quite happy this is the first time we're doing this. So
cool, go for it.
First question is, for user interviews, how do you go about drawing conclusions from statistically insignificant population?
Oh gosh, that's really interesting. I think in interviews with customers, I tend to be generative in nature. By generative, I mean you're talking to people with an open-ended, semi-structured conversation to understand about their lives better, understand how they use your product or how they don't use your product, depending on what the context is. And you're just empathizing with them and you're understanding better. An individual one of those, or 5 of them, or even 10 of them, you might struggle to identify patterns in that. And so you could do 10 customer interviews, invest, 7-8 hours of your time. And you might have a sense of something, but you could not say with certainty, well, I've spoken to 8 customers and therefore we're going to invest 3 months in building a solution for them. That would not be a good thing to do. Where customer interviews become really, really powerful is as a way for you to build your product intuition, your product sense over time within that domain and within that customer segment that you're serving by building products for them. So again, it's like, if that question comes from this idea of like, well, I'm going to start with doing customer interviews and then I'm going to go make some decisions, you'll fall into that kind of process trap a little bit. Whereas if you think about customer interviews as a gardening activity, I've got to drop the garden thing, haven't I? When you think about it as like a continuous activity, then, as you go over time, you see this ramp up of intuition that you have that's rooted in deep customer empathy. That's how you that's how you become customer centric. There's very few other ways to do it, in my opinion. I think the customer interview is really, really important. I think it's really important to have guardrails around how you do your customer interviews, and hope you have some experts in your organization who can help guide you to ensure that you're not kind of putting junk into your system, i.e. doing bad customer interviews, getting bad insights that are wrong through poor interviewing techniques or poor synthesis techniques. But super important to do that, I think, continuously and not think about it as a one-off thing. And then you just are able to completely skirt the idea of statistical significance and these qualitative research methods.
Yeah, definitely. And that's where, like, depends what the question is, and what type of decision you're trying to make on the back of those interviews or like the research you're doing. Would you also say like you'll have different segments for interviewing different types of customers over time as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where continuous interviewing is really cool, because the way I've always done it is I've always had sort of like a generic kind of guide to a conversation with a customer. Like if you threw me into a conversation with a clear customer tomorrow, I would have like a generic conversation I want to have them about their life, about how they interact with our product, how that kind of how it interacts with their day-to-day life. And I could just do that as a natural conversation. But then let's say in a couple of weeks' time, there's a particular problem that we've got, and we're like, is this a big enough problem? We've seen this in our data and we think this is causing a bit of a problem. And then we might say, okay, well, we want to kind of skew the way in which we're recruiting for these conversations to narrow the people who are looking to recruit to talk to a segment who we think are affected by that problem. And we'll just steer in that direction for a bit. Mm-hmm. And so you take all of your existing previous customer intuition that you've got, and then you speak to 3, 5, 8, 10 customers in that direction over the course of, 2 or 3 weeks. And your intuition around that segment and that problem, we think is you're able to give yourself confidence. Or, normally what would happen is that you would uncover some nuance, you'd uncover some things that when it comes to understanding the scale of this problem, kind of second order effects of this problem, the types of solutions that customers already try, or indirect competitors, you pick up so much nuance through those conversations that you can't get from just looking at data or just being creative in isolation. And then you can take that and influence some other continuous discovery activities around trying to solve that. So in short, kind of skewing and changing the way in which you do your recruitment, I think is important to be very deliberate about that, and not let your interviewing, as long as you're doing it continuously, just be too generic. It's okay to kind of tune in particular directions at certain times. Maybe some folks, if there are any researchers listening, might disagree with me, but that's my perspective.
Nice. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And the second question we have from the same person is how to do discovery for product distribution channels.
Yeah, Joe, I was talking about product distribution the other day, and it's actually not one of my strong areas, but it's a really good question, and one that maybe I won't have a great answer for. But if I think about it from first principles, you're kind of doing, to some extent, maybe some demand testing in particular channels. So if you're wanting to take your product to, I don't know, it's in an app or on a website or something, you might think, well, we want to take this product, the way in which we're delivering this to some social networks, or rather than having our shop in a Shopify shop, we want to have an Instagram shop or something. I think you're really just getting to realms of solution testing, and how you're testing what's the cheapest way that we can test that solution. So again, it depends on the context. If you have an e-commerce store, for example, I could imagine doing I can imagine an assumption that says, we think that by selling these products on an Instagram shop, we'll get more success. We'll get more, leads or people who are like empty basketing or whatever on Instagram than we would on our website. And you just want to say, okay, what is the thinnest thing that we can do that allows, like, can we quickly build an Instagram shop? How can we reuse the product things we already have elsewhere? I think maybe it would start with something like that. But I guess to get there first, you probably want to be thinking more exhaustively about what product distribution channels are possible for the type of product that you have. And maybe just think off the top of my head, you would maybe map all those out and then compare things like how much effort is it going to take to test these channels versus how much confidence do we have that this might be a good thing, and what evidence do we have to let us know. So yeah, not an area I'm massively experienced in, to be honest, but that's how I sort of think about it when I think about product discovery first principles.
Yeah, they're quite an interesting space. I feel like it goes more into marketing knowledge, doesn't it, to some level? Because you need to know about, for each platform, how much do you need to invest to actually get the return on it as well? Because I think individual tests might not be enough. You might need to actually invest for longer to see traction over time. So I think at that point, you probably want to work with the different experts in the different channels. If it is social media, look at the efficiency of it.
I think it depends on, the scale of your organization. If you're in a big organization, you've got product marketing, you've got growth marketing, you've got folks who would be really great collaborators for this sort of thing. If you're working in a startup with like 6 people, then you're going to have to get scrappy and do a lot of this stuff yourself and learn as you go.
And I wanted to ask, because I think there's a lot of documentation on like B2C product discovery overall. But obviously there's a lot more B2B companies now working with product. Is there like a difference? Like, how would you approach product discovery between like B2C company and B2B?
Yeah, my experience in B2B is a little more limited. I would say you observe a very different kind of culture in B2B companies. You've got different dynamics at play in the organization. Sales and marketing tend to have there's a slightly different dynamic between product and sales and marketing than there is in B2C companies. I would say the main difference I've observed when it comes to actually doing the craft of product or product discovery is access to customers and how you build that kind of customer centricity. Plainly, I think it's much harder at B2B businesses. In most B2B businesses, and not to say that there aren't exceptions where it's really difficult in B2C, but very broadly, it's harder to build that customer centricity in B2B organizations because the individual customers tend to be much more kind of powerful, if you know what I mean, than in B2C. They bring a lot more money with them. If a product person makes a mistake or says something they're not supposed to, and these are sort of things that people in sales and marketing worry about because they own the relationship with these people. People who account management, these people own these relationships with these people, and it's something that's part of their job. So by throwing them into a research session where we're going to talk about the future of our product in quite kind of fluffy terms, it's going to give them a bit of nervousness. So I think you've got to get, again, partially a people problem, and partially you've got to get creative in your own B2B environment and find ways of building customer centricity in the way that we talked about, how you accumulate that product intuition in your space over time by talking to people regularly. It's much harder in B2B. So think about other ways in which you're going to do it. I think industry events are a very good way to do that. Going to industry events and just having much kind of closer, unfettered access to people and talking about stuff. And that's a great way to do it. I think, sometimes at talks and conferences and events and these sorts of things in industry, you can also get a different version of people a little bit, and it's harder to unpick things. But even doing research, like kind of guerrilla research at those environments, I think is a really good way to do it. So yeah, so in short, it's very, very similar. The relationships with customers and how you get close and build that customer centricity is a bit different, and I think a bit harder.
Yeah, and I also think with B2C, you have an equal kind of majority of your customers have similar value. Of course, you have like your super loyal customers, but in B2B, each customer has a different weighting on the product, especially if you're early on, which means, do you consider the amount that they bring in when you're looking at the analysis of which opportunity should we go after? Because you probably would, because again, come back to that commercially mindful PM. So there's a few more layers, I think, in B2B.
Yeah, that's for sure. And yeah, you've got to be a little bit careful there sometimes, because if you build everything around a single customer, you're building more risk into your business as well. And I think product people should be very mindful of that notion of diversification in B2B businesses.
Nice. Okay, well, I mean, thank you so much. I really enjoyed going through this. It was, especially going through the slides. I mean, very sorry for anyone listening. Please do go to the YouTube because there's a lot of really interesting visuals there. Or buy Teresa Torres's book. That's also, we use so much of it. Might as well advertise for her. It's a great book, Continuous Discovery Habits. So thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed this. Any final thoughts you want to leave the audience with?
Yeah, I think there is. I think maybe if I was to reiterate one thing, it would be first thing is like not to be too hard on yourself if your environment is not perfect to do some of this stuff in like the most amazing way. And it's totally valid if you decide not to take on the challenge of trying to change your entire organization's culture from your position. As a completely reasonable and valid position for you to take in your organization. Maybe that's okay for you. Maybe it means in the medium to longer term, you want to find a new role where you can do some of this stuff. But maybe not. Maybe you're happy with the type of role you have right now, and that's completely cool. I think sometimes talking about these things and in very, really idealistic terms can make people feel not great. And I think it's not said enough that like, it's fine if you're not working in an environment that's like perfectly doing things as they are in the books. And if you do want to take on the challenge and try and make that organizational change, then more power to you. But yeah, that's it. Thank you for inviting me on, Diana. I've really enjoyed it.
No, thank you so much. Would you be open to people reaching out if they have any questions? And what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn, Barry Pace. Drop me a message. If particularly if you've heard me say anything that you think is like particularly egregious or that you disagree with, I'd love to hear that. Or I'm open to people messaging me. Go.
Nice. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. Bye.